Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
It is their job.
Jason, was it hard for you when God was pulling on your heart to leave ESPN in 2017? And you talk about in your book, Live to Forgive, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the few minutes we have remaining as well. Was that hard for you to leave your dream job? What were some of your internal struggles in leaving a job that you could have seen yourself working the rest of your life and being very happy doing so, but you felt God pulling you away to do something else? What type of internal struggles were you having trying to be pleasing to the will of the Lord as a Christian, but wanting to stay in your will as somebody that loved his job and what he was doing at ESPN?
Well, the hardest part wasn't knowing that God was in this. The hardest part was fully trusting in him and getting out of comfort. When you're at a place for 17 years, that's a long time to be working somewhere.
It is.
And you're not upset with your job. Like I said, that last year with Mike and Mike was probably my best year, my favorite year at ESPN. I did more traveling than I ever did. I made, just to be honest, I made more money than I ever did. And I loved going to work every day. So that's my battle, right? Like, do I want to leave something that feels and is a good situation, a very comfortable situation? A lot of great things come with it. Do I want to do that for the unknown? And listen, when I left, I had a job to leave to with Sports Spectrum, but it was 40% pay cut. There were no benefits. And it was a job that I was working remotely. So I went to an office with 4,000 people every day. Now I wake up and go into my spare bedroom and there's nobody but me. So there's a lot of change happening.
Hey, you were social distancing before it was cool to social distance.
Yeah, that's exactly right, my friend. Thankfully, I could travel a lot and go see people. I can't do that right now currently, but
yeah.
I was social distancing. But the internal struggle was, are you truly, God, going to provide here if I trust you? And that's, we talk as Christians a lot of time, like, yes, if you trust in God, he will make a way. He is the way maker, the miracle worker. He's a promise keeper. He will deliver and supply you all your riches and needs according to his purpose. Like, he says that, we say that, but when you actually have to do that, man, that's where the struggle lies.
Yeah.
And my struggle was, God, I'm going to do this because I really think it's for you, but are you going to be true to your word here? Because 40% pay cut and leaving all this stuff that I have with ESPN, like, is this really going to be the case? And so the internal struggle was, and even talking to my wife about this, was I kept telling her, God will make a way. I promise you this. If it's not from God, then I'll step right out of what I was doing and go right back to ESPN or go somewhere else. I promise you that. But I really believe this is the Lord speaking and opening up this door. Thankfully, I can tell you now, looking back 3 years later, that it was clearly God's will, God's plan. And he's, like I said earlier, he's opened up doors and given me more opportunities to do things that I never could have. This is all honesty, never could have dreamed of and did not dream of. So God clearly was in the midst of all of this, in this decision. And thankfully, he has provided and made a way and done what he says he would do when we walk out in obedience to him. But that's the internal struggle. And I think that's everybody's struggle, really. If you're a Christian and you're making a change, or you're trying to discern the voice of God and making that decision on whatever that means, you have to kind of step out onto the unknown ground and just put a faith and trust. That's what true faith is. And say, all right, God, I'm yours. This is yours. Take it, do whatever you want with it. And it's interesting because as I was leaving ESPN, I had already began formulating the book, Live to Forgive. So I knew that was sort of the beginning ground of me going out into different areas that I wasn't planning on going to in terms of writing and putting a book out. and I knew when I had my book come out, I had already left ESPN when it came out, that was a door that was going to open up something. I didn't know what, even if it was one person reading it, I didn't know what, but that was the sort of beginning steps, even while I was still at ESPN, to trying to obey God and do what he called me to do. And then Sports Spectrum came along, and that was for me, the clear call from the Lord to go do his work.
You mentioned your book, Live to Forgive, and it's an unbelievable story that you have. And I want to transition here in the few minutes that we have left with each other to talk about Live to Forgive. And you mentioned trusting God, but you also talk about in the book through some of the struggles that you had with your father. Your father was an alcoholic. You came from a broken home. I have to think that trust was something that you had to develop over time to learn to do, because there were so many unknown variables in your life that would cause you to mistrust. Talk about a little bit growing up in the home that you did with the father. Your relationship with your dad was real strained for a long time.
Yeah, the same dad that I think is the one responsible for my love of sports is the same dad that's probably responsible for many years of bitterness and anger and hatred, to be quite honest, with a very confusing, as I like to say, relationship. My dad is a real good person who has a zest for life and is very much a kid at heart, even at almost 70 years old today. But alcohol got the best of him, and it was a really bad situation for many, many years. Broken marriages, separation from kids, things like that. And then, depression kicked in later in his life in his early 60s. And it was a bad recipe for disaster for many, many years, which caused this roller coaster ride that I lived with my dad for many years to just continue to happen. Imagine, when you go on a roller coaster and you're around for 3 minutes, eventually it's going to stop and you're going to get off.
Yep.
We were on a roller coaster for 40 years, me and my brothers. And so that's not a fun ride to go on for many, many years. At some point you want it to stop going up and down. You want to kind of level it out a little bit. And it was very, very few moments in, the first 40 years of my life where we had a level playing field. It was an up and down roller coaster, back and forth. My dad would be sober, then he'd be drunk, and then he'd be angry, and then he'd be happy, and then he'd be, upset, and then he'd be furious, and then he'd be okay. And it was like, and, it was a separated relationship in the sense of I lived in Connecticut, he lived in New York, which is still the case. But he, for some reason, when he would drink, he would pick up the phone and call, and he would say some really abusive things when somebody accused him of drinking or had an issue with it. And it just turned him into it was Jekyll and Hyde. And he was whatever the bad one is. Jekyll, I think, is the bad one. He was the bad one for more often than not. And that's where really this book kind of stemmed from. Live to Forgive was moving forward when those we love hurt us, which is the subtitle, was really coming to a place for me, who have been a believer for 10 years. There it is right there. I see it. There it is. For 10 years, that relationship with my dad, even as a Christian, I couldn't forgive him. I had learned and started to grow in understanding what forgiveness was about. I had seen the cross and Jesus and redemption do a great work in my life, and asking Jesus and asking God to forgive me of my mess ups and sins every day. And yet I couldn't exude forgiveness back to my dad. And it wasn't until his lowest moment in 2013 that I finally was able to come to a place to forgive him. And then 5 years later is when the book came out. And the idea of the book was really something I never wanted to write. But I came to a place where I started sharing the story a little bit about 5 years ago. And somebody heard me share the story and said, you ought to put that in a book and it can help a lot of people. And I said, I'm not writing a book. No way. It's not anything I ever wanted to do was write a book. And had the opportunity come to me to write this book, partnered with my friend Steve Copeland. And I went to my dad before we moved forward with it. And I said, there's this opportunity to write this book about forgiveness, Dad, and you and I, and it's going to paint you as the villain for about 90% of the book. I said, and I want to be as honest and brutal and as truthful as I can. Are you okay with that? He said, Jace, if it can help one person, then you need to write it. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, you need to tell this story if you know it can help someone. And I said, okay, all right, let's go forward.
You've
with
got
this
two
thing.
other brothers too. You've got a brother that's a pastor, and
Yep.
you know, what was their reaction? Because obviously, not only were you telling your story, you were telling their story as well too.
Yep. I went to my whole family. I went to my wife, and my wife is great, but she was like, really? You're going to write a book? I said, well, I don't know if I'm going to
My
write
wife
a book,
said the
but
same thing.
and she didn't want anything in the book about her, which was
Yeah.
understandable. And for the most part, she's not in there. A little bit, you know, in terms of how my dad affected her and me. But my mom, my two brothers, my dad, those were the four that if any of them had reservations about writing this, I wouldn't have moved forward with it because it's their life. Less for my mom because, you know, my mom's she's a wonderful person, and she's the one that kept us together for so many years. And if she could have had her way, she would have been in about 50% of this book because of all that she went through. But I had to explain to her, this is not your story. This is mine. And I love you. I said, you'll be in the book, but this isn't about you. This is about me and Dad. And that was hard for her because she kept us afloat and, you know, is our rock and is my hero. When I think back to my kid and being a kid and just how much she was there for us and still is there for us. But she was all on board. My brothers were all on board. And then I went to my brothers and asked them for specific stories, not too many, but I said, I have my own memories. Do you guys have any? And they had one particular story, which I think was chapter 2. And it's literally, the chapter is titled "When My Brothers Wanted to Kill My Dad." And
I remember that story. That's a very poignant part of the book too, and it hits you very early.
Yes.
About the real tension and struggle that the three of you were facing with your dad.
Yeah, this is chapter 3. I said chapter 2, chapter 3, and it's the validity of anger. And I think the whole point there was to set the stage for, not only had my life been affected in this experiences, but there were moments that my brothers had with my dad that I did not have, that I needed to paint that picture if they were willing to tell it, so that they saw how bad this was. This wasn't just my experience. This was our experience. And they told the story of the time when my brother, Damien, I believe it was, wanted to truly kill my dad. He wanted to end his life because he was just fed up with everything my dad had done towards him. And this is, I don't know, 25 years ago or whatever. But yeah, and they both said and told their story in a very real and raw way, which is what we tried to do with the entire book. And so that's what it's about. And, you know, now it's been out for a couple of years, and I really have heard from many people, including yourself, about how this has helped them in their journey, or it's helped somebody that they know in their journey. And that's the whole point. I could tell you, I wish we sold 1 million copies and we were a New York Times bestseller. We're not, but I don't care about that. I really simply cared. And do I not care about numbers? No, I care about numbers, of course. And I'm very much a numbers guy, but we wrote it for the one who needed help. And
that's right.
That's happened. And so that's all we could have asked for.
Well, and for somebody to go through what you went through, a lot of people, I can't relate to that, because my mom and dad stayed married for 41 years. My dad was heavily involved in our church. My dad was there a lot of times. My dad was there for high school games, for Little League games. I can't imagine going through that.
Right.
But we all go through something that has hurt us to the core in some way, shape, or form. You don't go through this life unscathed, Jason. The Lord never promised that we would go through life unscathed, and somebody somewhere has hurt us. What is the biggest thing that you can share with someone about forgiveness that was a V8 moment for you? You know, right? We have all have those V8 moments where the answer just hits us in the head. What was that moment for you like about forgiveness?
The moment for me was when I realized it was not about me. It was not about me. And, you know, it's funny. I think of Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. The very first line in chapter 1 of the book, and it's sold millions and millions of copies. You want to talk about a book that's impacted people?
Yeah.
It says, it's not about you. And for me, it was really the moment when my dad was at his lowest point, when I realized this is not about my feelings or my anger or my bitterness. This is about God and what he's done for us. The person that we need to forgive, or the person, when we're forgiving someone else, it's about us being free from the bitterness.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I guess it is about us, but the idea of forgiveness is not about us. It's about what God has done, sending his son, forgiving us, the greatest gift we could ever have. And then it's about, to me, it's a game changer. And this took me a long time to have, and I think I'm still developing it, but it was about having an empathetic spirit. Empathy is the big game changer in life.
Yeah.
It really is. If we saw others the way that God sees them, it would change every single person's perspective on everything we have. Doesn't mean we can't have opinions. Doesn't mean we can't be angry. Doesn't mean we can't be upset. Doesn't mean we can't state those opinions. But if we had an empathetic spirit in everything that we did, it would be a game changer, because you'd know it's coming from a place of love, not from a place of bitterness and anger. So when I saw my dad as Jesus saw my dad, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about Jesus. And if Jesus saw dad the way that I do, he would look at him and say, you're nothing, you're worthless, you're nobody, you're a messed up person. But that's not what Jesus does. That's not what God.
That's right.
When God looks at all of us, he says, you're my child, you're valuable, your worth is not found in what you do, it's found in our relationship. And suddenly that changed the game for me. And it was in a moment in hearing my dad broken at his worst moment when I said, that's it. It's like the V8 moment, the light bulb's over the head. It's ding, ding, ding. The doorbell rings. That's it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't about me. It's about, or it wasn't about anything my dad had done to me. It was about being freed from the bitterness that I had, and about having an empathetic spirit and seeing my dad who he was, God's child.
And what you're really saying is, to a large degree, Jason, that the ground really is level at the cross. We all come to the cross the same way.
Yes.
We just have different pathways on how we get to the cross, but we get there, and people are still coming to the cross, because the cross is the ultimate place of forgiveness. It's the ultimate place where we trade our sins for his righteousness upon our lives. We trade what we've done wrong for what he did right at Calvary. And I commend you for that. I love what you said about empathy, because I think in this day and age, Jason, with what we're facing in this country at the time that we're recording this, that we need empathy more than ever before, because every one of us now, in some way, shape, or form, are being affected by this COVID-19 situation. And, you've been working from home for a while. I work at home on Fridays, but we're now working from home full time.
Yeah.
And so empathy is so important. I want to ask you this as we bring our time to a close, man. And we could do a 10-part series. This is so good, man. You have been so gracious with your time today. I want to ask you this. You talked about the biggest thing that you overcame was forgiving your dad and restoring that relationship. What is the biggest piece of intentional encouragement that you could leave with our audience today?
I think I gave it away, which was part of the empathy. I think, the biggest encouragement I would give, there's a couple of levels here. A lot of what I've been thinking about lately is, when you see someone else going through something, don't automatically judge them for what they're going through. Put a mindset that maybe they've been through something else. And I'll give you an example. I was on Facebook recently, and somebody posted a picture of a lady who had purchased like 15 things of toilet paper, right? And so her basket's full of toilet paper. And the post was, this woman is hoarding toilet paper. How dare she? And all the comments were people just jumping on her.
Yeah.
And it really dawned on me that might be the case. Maybe she was hoarding the toilet paper, whatever. But what if she worked at a hospital? What if she worked at a homeless shelter? What if she had, 10 elderly neighbors and she was buying them for them? Would that change your thought on her?
Great point.
I think it would. You wouldn't have posted that, your judgment, and you would have been like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Well, let's go with the, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know before we start judging and posting instead of after. And that's where I think the best piece of advice right now, and that comes back to empathy, right? But it really is about taking out that judgmental spirit that so many of us have, including myself. I'm judgmental just like everybody else.
Yep.
And just like you, Brian. But we have to get to a point where we get away from that judgmental spirit and try to see the good in every single person and situation. Now, there are moments, and I used to have this actually with like a homeless person that would come up and ask me for money. My judgmental spirit would be to give them the money was giving them a one-way ticket to more drugs or more alcohol or something. And again, that might be the case, but I have changed my perspective on that completely in the last 3 years. And now I don't have any issues with giving them money if they ask, if I have it. But that's about having more empathy, and I see that a lot, even for non-Christians. I see that buzzword a lot being used on social media in different places, but it's one thing to say it. It's another thing to practice it. And usually the cream rises to the top. And I hope that the more that rises to the top is, especially during these crazy times that we're in the middle of the pandemic, that empathy would always win out more than the judgmental spirit. Because listen, we're seeing that completely now in our government and how we view different sides on the politics area. We see it in sports. We see it in, even just like I said, Facebook posts and a picture of a woman buying all this toilet paper. It's easy to jump on her and say, why are you hoarding this? And yet, what if she isn't? What if she's actually doing something that's actually more meaningful and more powerful than you sitting behind your computer typing on Facebook? So I think my biggest encouragement would be to just look and see where people are and try to look and see the good in every person. And at the very least, have empathy to say, maybe they're doing this for a different reason, and we would do the same thing if we were in their shoes.
Man, so good. And what a great place to end this conversation, Jason. Tell folks where they can find your resources. Tell folks how they can connect with you. I would highly encourage you to check out Jason's resources, and you will be encouraged. I tell you what, you post a lot of things on Twitter that are very encouraging and uplifting, and I appreciate that from somebody that's doing intentional encouragement. I appreciate that. Tell my audience how they can find you and connect up with you.
Yeah, if you simply type my name in Google, you will find me. But it's my website, jasonromano.com, is probably the best place, like, for the resources that you referred to. As far as the book, you can actually read the first chapter of Live to Forgive for free there before buying it. Those books are available on my website, but they're available at Amazon as well, and Books A Million, and all the places you buy books. Both the older book, Live to Forgive, and the new one coming out July 21st, The Uniform of Leadership. You can pre-order that now. That's available there. And then my social media, like you mentioned, Twitter. I'm probably on Twitter the most, but I am on Instagram a lot, and certainly Facebook a little less. But it's weird, during these times, I find myself on social media more. And I think it's not just because I'm addicted to it, which I do think there's an element to that too, but I want to connect with people, and we can't go out and give hugs and gather with large groups right now. So this is the virtual best way that we can do that, is through calls like this on Zoom, or through going to Facebook and trying to connect that way. So you can find me on social media, pretty active right now, especially. Love to hear from you.
Hey, I told Jason before we started, I have my ESPN pullover on today as we air this, and I got to ask you real quick. So, does Sports Spectrum have any merchandise? If people want, talk about your current ministry, Sports Spectrum, because that's an important ministry as well. Folks in our audience can get involved with the ministry of Sports Spectrum as well.
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, I should have said that. Go to sportspectrum.com. That's the website to go to. Has a bunch of content there. You can order our magazine, which is a quarterly magazine. Certainly subscribe to the podcast, which is what I am really entrenched in and doing work every day on the podcast. And we're also a radio show. So if you happen to be in Washington, D.C. area, if you're listening to this, we are on 100.7 FM WFAX in Washington, D.C. With our radio show at 9 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. So the radio show is actually the same as the podcast. It's just a shortened version, but it's a different audience. It brings the show to a different range of listeners. And we're at least talking right now of expanding Sports Spectrum into a network. And I don't know what that looks like, whether it's a podcast network or if there's opportunities to do things from a video perspective a little bit more. But the ministry is growing, and it's, I was just telling you before we started, our podcast listenership is up. We have more subscriptions to magazines in the last couple of years than we've had, in the last 5 years before that combined. Our website traffic is high. And it's really because we've found that there are a ton of sports fans who love Jesus.
Yep.
And there isn't really a place for them to find content that can appease them. If you want to read about sports, you got to go to ESPN. If you want to read about faith, you got to go to Christianity.com or something like that. Well, we try to bring them together. And this has been a ministry that's been around for a long time. But I think now in the past 3 years, we've been able to, bring it into the 21st century and allow for people to be reached where they're at, whether it's on their web, on their phone, on their desktop, on their device, whatever it is, on the web, and the old-fashioned way with a magazine. But even with the podcast, this has been something that I've really been blessed to be a part of, and I love the work that I get to do. And as we say, we like to bring the name of Jesus back into the conversation of sports. And there are a ton of believers out there who play sports, who talk about sports, who coach sports, that don't really have an outlet to talk about Jesus.
Yep.
And that's what we provide.
Well, and right over my shoulder, I've got an autographed picture of Mike Krzyzewski. I have a picture that I took with Lou Holtz. So I've got the Mike and Mike picture. Yeah, I'm a sports fan. I'm a Reds fan. I've been a sports fan. But Jason, and again, I said we were going to wrap this up, but you brought something to my attention here. It's okay to be a sports fan and be a Christian. And those that maybe are not Christians that are listening to this, we're missing sports. You're missing sports. I'm missing sports. It's okay to have that balance in your life. While you're social distancing, though, maybe it's a time that it's a good thing that we're unplugged from sports, because it's an opportunity for us to reconnect with reading. Read, Live to Forgive. It's an unbelievable book. You will enjoy it. Reading, just meditating, thinking, about things instead of being so consumed with media. And a lot of the media that we're getting is not good news, but just taking this time to reflect. And maybe this is a good thing, because it's stopped a lot of us, and we have to just say, okay, we're going to spend time with the people that we love the most and are around the most. And even athletes, man, like you get to talk to with the Sports Spectrum. You think we miss sports? How about the guys that play the games? They miss it.
But this is a time, they do miss it, but this is a time, I think, and you can kind of see this because shows are doing their best to keep sports in the range of being talked about. And there's some truth to that. However, I think it's forcing people, and all these shows are broadcasting from home now. It's forcing people to say, I love sports, but sports can't be my life because it can be taken away from me like that. And then what?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what's taken place with me over the last month or so since this thing took away sports was, okay, I love sports. I miss it. I want to watch, the Mets play with Sarah, like I said, but I don't need sports. And that was actually starting to deteriorate a little bit while I was at ESPN. I still love my teams. Trust me, I'm going to be there every single game that my team is playing when I can be. But if I can't watch a game or I miss a game, or if they lose, I get up the next day. I'm still, I think people are appreciating life a lot more. They're seeing the fragility of life, and they're seeing how quickly everything can be taken away. And this is, it's a time of urgency for me as a man, as a husband, as a dad, more than it is as a sports guy.
Yeah.
The urgency that I have and feel in my heart is to tell others about Christ, because that's the one thing that we all have in common is we're all going to die someday.
That's right.
And where are we going? And for me, that urgency, that burden. We're seeing a lot of deaths now, all at once, and we're trying to. And I think that is questioning. Everyone is questioning their mortality a little bit, and saying, "Oh, wait, I thought I had control over something that I truly have zero control over. I better figure this thing out and get this thing right." And so my spirit has been burdened to tell others about Christ and eternity and salvation, because that, to me, I just harp on the words of Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John 14:6. Like that is a haunting verse from the words and the mouth of Jesus himself. You cannot get to heaven unless you come through me, Jesus.
Well, and you
trust in me. So that's where my burden's been.
And, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of athletes train their whole life. You saw guys come through ESPN. You've gotten to know professional athletes. This is what they've done all of their lives since they were small, and realized that they had talent, greater talent than most, to be a professional athlete. And now maybe they're even looking and saying, I don't know when we're going to play. I don't know what we're going to do in the next month or so. I don't know what we're going to do the next 2 months. And Jason, you hit on it a little bit ago in our conversation. It's changing the thinking of what we worshiped to who we worship.
Yep.
And we haven't had sports to just go, oh my goodness, the opening day in Cincinnati is a big thing for Reds fans.
Yep.
The NFL draft is coming up. That's a huge thing for NFL football fans. Well, guess what? A lot of these things have been. Wimbledon just got postponed or just got canceled. It's a big thing for tennis fans. And we've had to flip the script from what we worship to who we worship. Instead of worshiping our idols. Yeah, our sports idols. They're not a part of our daily lives now. So it's really forced that conversation, to your point, back to making Jesus and your eternity a critical part of every conversation, internally and externally.
Well, as believers, I mean, listen, if we're not living a life as believers to push people to Christ, we're missing the whole thing. Like, if all we're talking about is sports and all we're posting about is sports, even if we're big sports fans who love Jesus, then we're missing it, and that's really been something on my spirit for the last 6 months, really, but even more in the last month or so.
Man, oh man, this has been such good conversation, and I've just kind of made an on the fly call. We're going to break this conversation into 2 parts so you can hear it, because this is just great conversation. And I just want to encourage somebody listening today to get with Jason, get a hold of his resources while we're social distancing at the time we're recording this. Hop on Amazon, get the book Live to Forgive, and read it, and just take in what this good man has to say, and go to Sports Spectrum, get his resources, download the podcast. It'll help you. Jason, man, you have been so incredibly gracious with your time. It's an honor to call you a friend. Thank you so much for hopping on the Intentional Encourager podcast today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
My thanks, as always, to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. And until next time, remember, everyone, everywhere, at any time, and any place can be an intentional